The last time I was up north with you in my homily series on the different cultural issues, I finished up a series of topics concerning sexual morality. And this past weekend on the southern end, I began to apply the core of the gospel message, just as I've been doing, but now to a different issue, and this time of racism. Racism seems to be spoken of a lot more recently, though not usually considered from a Catholic perspective, and oftentimes used, unfortunately, as even kind of a name-calling or as a way to shut down discussions between people who don't agree with one another. And as Catholics, we certainly do understand racism to be a sin, because since holding one race as superior to another's as justification to ridicule or mistreat or discriminate against persons of other ethnicities, that's obviously contrary to the Christian worldview. Because if we follow the core of the gospel, as we've done each time, we'll find that we have a common origin, that every human being, in every culture, has been made in God's image. We have a common fall as well, that all of us have inherited original sin. Praise God, all of us have a common redemption. Salvation was won for every single person through Jesus Christ. And that means we're all made for a common destiny, the eternal happiness of heaven. So racism is a sin because it denies this Christian account of human nature. And I don't necessarily draw our attention to it because I think that there's racism hidden beneath, below within our hearts, but rather the hope that for us as Christians, this understanding has been ingrained within us so much, the dignity of every human being. But because we all sin, even though we know this, it's good for us to consider, how do we see our brothers and sisters? How do we love or sometimes fail to love our neighbor? And in my homily last week, I described that racism is clearly condemned within the scriptures and the church's teaching. And I kind of went and looked through some of those last week, even though the term itself doesn't really have an origin until more modern times. Traditionally, there's a broader category of sin which racism falls within, that of rash judgment. And considering what rash judgment is can actually help us to better evaluate situations, both where people may claim racism is present, but also reflect upon our own tendencies to maybe judge one another, even when it has nothing at all to do with racism. So I want to focus on rash judgment. Rash judgment consists in making a conclusion that questions someone's character without having sufficient evidence to do so. So, for example, in last weekend's readings, we were warned in the second reading not to judge people based upon something like money, whether someone's rich or poor, based upon what kind of clothes they happen to wear. That's a kind of rash judgment against that person. Or, for example, say, you see somebody that you know well, and you kind of make brief eye contact, but they don't really acknowledge you at all. And then interiorly you begin thinking, are they mad at me for some reason? What's going on there? And as you continue to mull over it, you work yourself up to a state in which now I'm angry back at them. But the reality might have been they were just really worried about something and they didn't even actually see you at all. But we've kind of formulated that rash judgment that can lead us to think poorly of others based upon very little actual indication. So rash judgment is actually described a couple times in the Gospels and through our daily masses this past week. Jesus said at one point, "Stop judging and you will not be judged." Or in another one, he said, "Why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye and ignore the wooden beam in your own?" Because we can spend time judging somebody else, trying to assume that we know their intentions on oftentimes little evidence, while we avoid admitting our own faults. Go back and put the relationship between rash judgment and racism. Racism is can kind of build up out of rash judgment. Judging the worth of another person specifically based upon an insufficient reason like race or skin color or language or some kind of particular cultural habit. Because none of those kinds of features of an individual has anything at all to do with their worth. Because all of us have great dignity being made in God's image. So when somebody rashly judges another based in this way, denies their due based upon ethnic or racial identity, then it becomes the sin of racism. So that's how it fits in here. Let's go back to rash judgment more general then. St. Thomas Aquinas reflects that there could be a few different reasons that are within someone's heart for why we might have a tendency to judge somebody rashly. So he said, maybe if somebody has kind of a preconceived prejudice toward that person already. So let's say, there's this guy, I don't really like him, and I hear some of these rumors about something he might have done, and it must be true because I already know that I don't like him. So that's got to be the case. But that's a rash judgment if we don't have that actual information. Or, St. Thomas says too, maybe somebody has been hurt by somebody else in the past, and that might lead them to be more suspicious about others into the future, even if there's only slight indications. So, to give an example, say a girl is teased when she's younger, and her classmates would whisper and laugh at her behind her back and even say things to her face that are hurtful. And those sins against her wounded her in such a way that now she has a suspicion towards other people that they might be doing that as well. And it makes it hard for her to make friendships. And maybe when she's older, she notices a group of people off on their own, they're laughing and they're talking, and it comes to her mind this thought, well, maybe they're laughing and talking about me. In reality, their conversation has nothing to do with her at all. But that kind of temptation to question, to judge, comes into her mind, and if she allows it to grow into a rash judgment, then she might come away with certain thoughts that, they're being mean to me, when the reality is nothing at all is behind that. And so we might too consider, do I allow past hurts that some people have done against me to lead me to make unjust judgments against others when I don't have that kind of information? And that too could also apply even to a case of perceived racism. Somebody who maybe has been hurt in the past by racist words and actions, it leaves a deep wound within them, and it could lead them to a continued suspicion against others, especially of a different race. Is that person, the way they looked at me, are they avoiding me? Do they dislike me because I'm different? We have different races? Because, unfortunately, that's what many people try to say is always happening within our cultures. And perhaps the person in question just ended up not smiling at them because it didn't have anything to do with race at all, but they were having a bad day. Or maybe they treated that person poorly because, unfortunately, sometimes we can be jerks to one another. Maybe they're not discriminating when they're a jerk to other people. But it could be that the person did that out of racism. But unless there's a clear enough evidence for us to make that judgment, we can't rashly come to that conclusion. So, while everyone should be against the sin of racism, we can't make further judgments, rash judgments, in the name of trying to root racism out. So, for example, to call somebody a racist based on insufficient evidence is itself a case of rash judgment. Or to call an entire group of people racist based only upon the fact that those persons happen to be members of a certain ethnicity is a rash judgment itself too, which ends up being racism. To kind of broaden our picture back again and look at rash judgment as a whole, one of the daughters that can come out of rash judgment is the sin of gossip. You assume something of another person, and now you share that assumption with another person with kind of intention of spreading this kind of hurtful knowledge, and then that gets spread to another person, and that gets spread to another person after that. Even though it all started with really a minimal amount of evidence. for its truthfulness. Rash judgment, especially when it ends up getting shared with other people through gossip, can do a lot of damage. And we shouldn't consider that sin lightly. Also worth mentioning are two other related sins to rash judgment. The first one's the sin of calumny, or more commonly called slander. And that's making false and defamatory statements for the specific reason of trying to damage someone else's reputation. I don't like that person, so I'm going to make up something about them, or even just exaggerate something about them, so as to make other people also stop liking them as well. That's calumny or slander, and it is a sin. Second, related to rash judgment, is the sin of detraction. And that's when it's hurting somebody's good name by disclosing some kind of incriminating truth, something bad that they did, but that technically is true. And so an example in our world today would be those who seek to cancel others through social media by bringing back to light some kind of minor offense that the person did perhaps years before in order to keep them accountable, they say. But in actuality, they're committing the sin of detraction by doing that. And having looked at those examples, maybe we can understand that, unfortunately, rash judgment is pretty widespread in our world today. News outlets, they rush to analysis before all the facts are in, maybe even bringing experts in to justify some of the rash judgments that they end up making. Social media, online comments seem to be a place where we automatically end up judging one another based on very, very little information about the other person. And we need to guard ourselves against that occasion of sin in our life, that temptation to place judgments on other people. Because digesting that kind of material can lead us into the kind of bitterness toward one another that we can so much see. Instead, St. Francis de Sales says that virtuous people must refuse to be mixed up with the clouds and the fogs of their neighbors' questionable doings. Instead, consecrate their energies on their own improvement and good resolutions. So instead of focusing on what everybody else is doing, Francis says, focus on my own growth in virtue, or as Jesus would say, our own plank and our own eye. The virtue of humility refrains from coming to a conclusion when the information is lacking. Humility enables us to admit that I don't know everything about that. And instead we should begin by assuming goodwill of the other person. Presume a more charitable interpretation until the facts require you to do otherwise. Finally, when it comes to overcoming rash judgment, whether it be racism or rash judgment in general, simply getting to know another person who might at first be perceived as being different from us can go a long way into being able to see each other as brothers and sisters. Do I see that person as a unique individual created by God, or do I judge them based upon a preconceived idea of a group? Next weekend, I want to help us to kind of critique some of the race theories that have been proposed that actually don't really fit with Catholic thought, but rather end up doing greater harm than good. Because traditionally, the church doesn't really speak about racism, about different races, because in truth, there's only one race, the human race. All mankind has equal dignity, as I said already. The Catechism says that created in the image of the one God and equally endowed with rational souls, all men have the same nature and the same origin. Redeemed by the sacrifice of Christ, all are called to participate in the same divine beatitude. All, therefore, enjoy equal dignity.